excited to be here to present some preliminary findings from the Western Settlement Outcomes Survey. This was a team effort, so before I get started, I do want to acknowledge, whoops, what have I done? Okay, there we go. Acknowledge the collaborators, so of course Vicky, who I think you've been on most of the projects so far over the past few days. Lori Wilkinson, who presented some of these findings at the National Settlement Conference, so you may have seen some of this. Lee Zong, and then two of Lori's grad students, Janine and Jill. So I do have lots to cover today. I will be moving pretty quickly, but if I get too fast, just let me know and I'll slow down for sure. Okay, so what I'm going to be presenting today are the results from the Settlement Outcomes Survey. So the main objective of this survey was to examine immigrant settlement experiences and outcomes in the Western provinces, so the 4 provinces of the new Western CIC region. So to do this, we conducted a telephone survey in April and May of this year. So these data are very recent, and we surveyed approximately 3,000 immigrants across the West. The idea here is to provide some information that may inform policies, programs, services, and resources to ultimately improve settlement outcomes. It's important to note that today I'm only going to be presenting some sort of broad overview findings, some frequency distributions, and we have lots of additional analyses that we want to do. So there's lots of capacity to run additional analyses, and we're excited about some of the future directions, but today it's going to be just some basic frequencies. And in keeping with the themes of today's session, I'm going to focus on use of the internet, desire for pre-arrival information, economic integration, and feelings of belonging. So Vicki and I have tried to present some different findings from the Alberta survey and the Western Settlement Outcomes Survey, but you'll see some overlap as well. Important to note, though, that these are 2 separate data sets. Okay, so a little bit about the methodology, and again, you'll see some similarities from the Alberta survey because that was the inspiration for this one. So roughly 3,000 immigrants were in our final sample, a little bit less than that. Everyone was at least 18 years of age or over and had been living in one of the 4 Western provinces for somewhere between 3 months and 5 years. As far as additional inclusion criteria, everyone had become a permanent resident of Canada within 5 years and had been living in Canada for a maximum of 10 years. So we had fairly equal sample sizes across the 4 provinces, as you can see there. So somewhere between 713 and 750 respondents from each of the provinces. So it's important to note that this was a random sample of immigrants based on a contact information data set provided by CIC of all the landings between January 1st, 2008 and December 31st, 2012 of individuals who indicated that they planned to reside in one of those Western provinces. So again, this is a random sample. Okay, so we used computer-assisted telephone interviewing, or CATIE, and we had 2 labs working with us to help us collect these data. So we had the SSRL, the Social Sciences Research Laboratories from University of Saskatchewan. They helped us collect data in Manitoba and British Columbia. They had about a 27% response rate to the calls that they made. And then we also had the Population Research Lab out of the U of A collecting data in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and they had roughly a 38% response rate. So we used a subset of original or slightly adapted items from the Alberta Settlement Outcomes Survey, but we did add 6 additional questions based on some really valuable feedback that we received from our Intergovernmental Advisory Committee. So we had to, we really needed to reduce the length of the survey. So as Vicki mentioned, the Alberta survey took about 34.5 minutes to complete, and we needed to cut it down to about 20. So we had to make some really ruthless decisions, which is always hard to do as a researcher because every item seems important. So we had some heated debates about which items were going to stay in there. But the majority of the questions did use 7-point response scales. The survey was available for completion in English, French, Mandarin, Punjabi, and Spanish. And among the survey's that were administered by the Population Research Lab at the U of A who tracked this information, roughly 90% were completed in English. I'll tell you a little bit about the respondents. So it's important to note that for those of you that have seen the report, which is available on the P2P website, I'm presenting some different information today. So the report was written by province. Everything was broken down by province. And today I've amalgamated all the data and I'll be presenting the findings across the provinces. So as far as respondents, respondents ranged in age from 18 to 85. The average age was 37, which according to what I heard yesterday, apparently is very old. But I'm refusing to acknowledge those comments that I heard. About 75% of the people were between 25 and 44 years of age, and there's about a 50-50 gender split. So most of the data that I'm going to be presenting today, and I hope those of you at the back can see the x-axis there at the bottom. I was struggling a bit yesterday myself. But just to quickly orient you to these charts, although I'm sure your eyes are starting to glaze over, you've seen so many over the past few days, but the y-axis is typically percent here, and these are frequencies. So for most of the questions, participants had to choose one option, but I will point out to you when they could choose multiple options, and then those responses wouldn't necessarily add up to 100. But basically what you see here is that the average length of time that individuals had resided in their province was 3.5 years, and you see quite a bit of variability. The most frequent response was between 4 and 5 years. As far as immigration category goes across the provinces, about 29%, skilled workers and professionals, 36 family class, 22 provincial nominee. But you see that there's quite a bit of variability when you start slicing and dicing this based on the province. So for instance, in Alberta, it's about 40% of the respondents were skilled worker, but then that number is a lot smaller in Manitoba, it's under 20. About 40% of respondents were principal applicants, and 85 to 90% resided in urban areas. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to the block of questions about information needs and use. You'll see a little bit of overlap here with some of the information that Vicki presented. So we did ask participants up until now, where have you found information on settling in your province? And the top two responses, and hopefully you can see these, I'll just point these out to you. This here is government websites, and over here on the side, we have family and friends. And so those are the top two reported sources of information. Again, here people could choose multiple options, so these numbers don't necessarily add up to 100. But in a nutshell, what you see is that people are reporting that they access settlement information from online sources to a far greater extent than traditional forms of print media such as newspapers and magazines. So because nearly 60% of respondents said family and friends, and we'd seen this already in the Alberta survey, one of the members of our Intergovernmental Advisory Committee said, let's dig into this a little bit and figure out what's going on. So if people are saying, well, I'm getting information from my family and friends, well, where are they getting information from? So we asked them, what's your best guess of where people are getting this information? And interestingly, what you see here is that a similar pattern to the last slide. So most people think that, okay, my family and friends are also getting information from government websites and other online sources. In other words, they're kind of saying, well, they must be doing the same thing that I'm doing. So this is their perception of where family and friends are getting this information. So we also looked into ease of internet use, both pre-arrival and then within the first 6 months of arrival. So we asked respondents on a scale of 1 to 7, if 1 is not at all easy and 7 is extremely easy, before you came to your province, how easy was it for you to use the internet? And what you can see here, so the midpoint of this scale is 4, you see that 85% of respondents are indicating that it was fairly easy. So 85% of people are above the midpoint here, with 60%, 60% saying, you know, it was extremely, extremely easy. And so this is the second question, which is ease of internet use within the first 6 months after arrival. And here we see that 90% of respondents are now rating this above the midpoint of the scale, with over 60% saying, extremely easy for me to use the internet within the first 6 months of arrival. And Audrey gave me some really interesting ideas here about maybe starting to break this down by age. So that's an interesting question and something that we'll certainly look into. So, really, taking some of these findings in conjunction, we see that internet use is easy. Newcomers are often obtaining settlement information from government websites, so not surprisingly, and I'm not going to present a chart for this, but when we asked newcomers, how would you like to receive information, the vast majority said websites, 75%. Okay, and Vicki also presented these data for the Alberta survey, but as far as the Western Settlement Outcome Survey, when we asked respondents, before you came to Canada, what services would have been helpful for you to have had, again, they could select multiple options here. We see strong endorsement for every service that we mentioned, many of these relating to employment. So things like assessment of international education is the first one, skills training for employment and things like that. So we see about at least half of respondents indicated, these employment services would have been really helpful pre-arrival. Okay, I'll turn now to economic integration. This is a keen interest of mine. About 55% of respondents were employed full-time, 15% were employed part-time, and about 11% were unemployed, 8.5% looking for work, and 2.5% unemployed and not looking for work. Again, we do see some variations depending on province for that one. As far as hourly income goes, 2/3 of respondents made between $10 and $25 an hour. So $10 to $15 an hour was the most frequent response that we saw. So you can kind of see this cluster here. So about 2 out of every 3 respondents are falling into that area there. Okay, skill utilization. This is one of my favorite questions because of my interest in underemployment. But we asked respondents on a scale of 1 to 7, if 1 is not at all and 7 is extremely, tell us how much your job lets you use the skills you have from your education and training. So you see sort of an interesting distribution here. So, fully 17-18% of respondents are saying, not at all. My job doesn't use my skills at all. But then on the opposite end of the distribution, you have about 60% of respondents above the midpoint saying, my job sort of does use my skills. So people kind of fall into all categories here, which is similar to what you see in our question about, how difficult have you found it to get a job that uses your qualifications. Again, we have strong endorsement of essentially every response option here. So below the midpoint of this scale, so people are saying, it wasn't difficult or it was easy for me to find a job. We've got about 40% of people in here, but then we've got about 48% of people on the opposite end. So we sort of have all response options being endorsed, so not a clear pattern emerging. So there's a lot of variation in how difficult people are finding it. And as Vicki said, it may be that outcomes improve over time, or there's other interpretations, and we haven't looked at that just yet. So the final set of questions that I'm going to look at are sense of belonging. So we asked respondents on a scale of 1 to 7, if 1 is very weak and 7 is very strong, how would you describe your sense of belonging to your local community? And we defined local community as the city, town, or neighborhood where you live. And what we see is that respondents felt a strong sense of belonging to their local community. So about 70% are rating their sense of belonging as above the midpoint, so fairly strong. And I believe that this will be discussed in a future presentation on this panel. We also asked respondents about their sense of belonging to Canada. So we wanted to look at local community, but also Canada. And here you see even stronger endorsement. So we moved from 70% of respondents being above the midpoint now to 80% of respondents being above the midpoint. So, and again, you'll hear additional discussion about this. But now we've got some sort of negatively skewed distributions that are fairly easy to interpret and are clearly saying, you know, people feel that a sense of belonging to Canada. All right, as I said, today I just sort of presented a broad overview of the results, but there's lots of room for additional analyses. Some of the things we're hoping to do are some cross-tabulations by demographic and other factors. So starting to slice and dice this by things like length of time in the province, immigration category, things like that. Looking at some multivariate analyses to try to predict these outcomes, and some statistical comparisons of outcomes and, you know, information needs and use of services across the different provinces. So lots of people to acknowledge, and as I mentioned, the full report is available on the P2P website, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session or during the break. Thanks.